It's a real honor to be here talking about the Lutyens Memorial Volumes, surely one of the most important architectural books of the 20th century. And it's been a lot of fun researching the history of these volumes and finding out where exactly they came from. The Lutyens Memorial Volumes is one of the most thorough records ever produced of the work of an individual modern architect. The idea of creating such a record with the express intention of memorializing a great architect and allowing his work to be studied by succeeding generations, I believe, is unique. The profusion of technical drawings is also unusual for an architectural book. The drawings are printed large enough that they can be measured and analyzed, so they are actually useful for practicing architects. Here in the Lutyens Memorial Volumes is the raw material of Lutyens architecture. Here is an architectural publication of singular quality and practicality. The creators of the Lutyens Memorial Volumes always intended that their publication should influence architectural practice. It was not about making Lutyens' chimneys and window shapes available for copying, but about helping his successors understand the controlling geometries, the sensitivity to material and context, and the approach to composition and planning that made Lutyens' work so powerful. The idea for a memorial publication initially came from Lutyens' son, Robert. He had originated the idea several years before his father's death, and for a decade, he remained the driving force behind the project. Robert's own book on Lutyens had been published by Country Life in 1942. This was a barely illustrated, rather theoretical text proposing that an armature of planes govern Lutyens' geometrical system of design. Sir Edwin's only recorded reaction to his son's tribute was to say that he could not understand a word of it. Issued in the middle of the war, it had not sold well. In 1942, Lutyens was dying, and Robert was serving in the Royal Air Force, not sure that he himself would survive. Lutyens' buildings, especially those in London, were in danger from bombing. The great architectural writer Christopher Hussey, editor at Country Life and longtime Lutyens promoter, encouraged Robert to write the book and helped him with the manuscript. In the book's first sentence, Robert Lutyens had announced his intention that a more comprehensive work on his father's architecture should be published after the war. He also noted that, quote, "One day his letters will be available, and these will have to speak for him." Thus, by the time of Lutyens' death on January 1st, 1944, a plan for the memorial volumes was already in place. On February 19th, Robert wrote to the secretary of the Royal Institute of British Architects, expressing the family's wish that a set of memorial volumes be produced, and that their creation be entrusted jointly to Christopher Hussey and the architect Arthur S.G. Butler, whom he described as an appreciative friend of my father. To achieve this end, he suggested the creation of a memorial committee, with RIBA nominating a member. Nudging them towards a sympathetic nominee, he wrote that the family would be particularly welcome to the cooperation of a traditionalist architect such as Edward Morf. He further expressed the intention to donate Lutyens' drawings to the Institute after they were sorted and copied for the memorial volumes. In the meantime, he asked if they would like a copy of the bronze bust of Lutyens that had been sculpted for Viceroy's house. They were happy to accept this offer. The memorial volumes were the product of the end of a life. They were a very human thing. The idea was to take the work of a great architect and transmit his genius to future generations. It was a memorial in the true sense of the word, because if we don't record things, they are lost. The need for the books was obvious. It was clear to an aging generation of architects who knew why Lutyens was great, that many of the younger generation did not. The purpose of the books, Arthur Butler wrote, was so that students and all architects may understand clearly and finally why and how the great distinction of these buildings was achieved. The whole point is to press home and explain in plain English, superbly illustrated, why Lutyens was a very great architect. Amidst an iconoclastic generation bent on tearing down the traditional practice of architecture and creating something new from scratch, the book was conceived as a sort of time capsule. The authors were lobbing architectural civilization into the future, where they hoped it would sit on library shelves gathering dust through the coming dark ages until its discovery could help rekindle the light. That may sound hyperbolic, but that in one sense was how the project's creators saw it. In the 1942 book Robert Lutyens had written, "I believe him to be among the dozen or so great European architects of the past 5 centuries. Yet, how much of his work will survive the disorder of these times?" He bemoaned, quote, "tradition's bankruptcy," and declared his own generation faithless to the past as well as to the future, in which we have no place. For Robert, tradition meant the vernacular. It meant a tradition of craftsmanship undermined by industrialization. He saw his father as part of a vernacular revival started by Norman Shaw and Philip Webb. Disheartened by the direction of the modernist movement, Christopher Hussey shared Robert's view. And his concluding chapter, with its warnings about the direction of British architecture, was approved by the committee chairman, Sir Jasper Ridley. The chairman's preface, which opened the 1950 edition of The Life and explained the need for the series, although it was signed by Ridley, was in fact written by Robert and heavily edited by Hussey. As we will see, the authors were not alone in their sense of pessimism. The initial concept was for a series of books, overseen by a memorial committee made up of family members, former clients, and representatives of the architectural profession. The books could be prepared one at a time and issued serially. Even after issuing the 4-volume set in 1950, the committee considered producing additional volumes on furniture, moldings, or unbuilt projects. The large quarto format was suggested by Lutyens' daughter Ursula, inspired by the publications of the Wren Society. It made sense to make the books as large as was manageable, so that the drawings would be clear and measurable. Another key aspect of the plan was that any profits from donations and on the sale of the books would be given to the Royal Academy Architecture School. Late in life, Lutyens had developed an enthusiasm for reforming English architectural education. In fact, he had hoped that it might be possible to found an entirely new architecture school. The creation of a fund in his memory at the Royal Academy was meant to begin to bring some of his ideas to fruition. Lutyens seems to have conceived the idea of creating a new architecture school around 1938, the year that he was elected president of the Royal Academy. He had lectured at the Royal Academy for years, and he may have seen an opportunity in its nearly defunct architecture school. The draft prospectus for his new school, however, which he asked Lawrence Whistler to write up from notes, simply states that the school would need to be somewhere in the home counties, so that it could be influenced by what he saw as the 3 centers of English culture, London, Oxford, and Cambridge. Its aim was described as follows. Within the last 100 years, many enormous changes, for better or for worse, have come upon our civilization. The Industrial Revolution, the metamorphosis of an agricultural community into an urban one, speed in travel, and the spread of education. Such things, it is well known, have shaken culture to its roots. It is in the position of a man suddenly transported to another planet, struggling to adapt his body to a different atmosphere and different nourishment, struggling, in fact, to keep alive. Art is not dying, but traditional culture, which is the very soil of art, and without which it perhaps cannot exist for long, is in danger of disappearing in the modern world, with its vast and effective machinery for spreading second-rate ideas, and a form of education which has no roots in the people whatever. Those who appreciate this situation are concerned more and more to save, before it is too late, the valuable teaching and traditions of the past. The educational scheme outlined here is mainly concerned with attempting this service for architecture, which of all the arts is most essentially dependent on a living tradition because of its social nature. Education at this new school would focus on the practical. Students would study the building crafts and allied arts, such as painting, sculpture, and music. Sculpture, Lutyens felt, would encourage students to think about three-dimensional form, rhythm, and mass. Music would teach order and symmetry, painting, color harmony, and balance in design. There would be prize funds for leading students to erect buildings of their own design for local charities. Theoretical lectures and pompous academics would be banned. Thus, quote, while the history of architecture would be taught, archaeology would form no part of the curriculum. And architectural history would focus on the how of architecture rather than the when. For understanding systems and technical problems, students would study astronomy and clockmaking, and most importantly, they would study geometry and mathematics. Quote, for architectural harmony is found in mathematical proportions. Lutyens identified another major field of study as forestry and landscape. Garden design, quote, must of course be one of the most important branches of this work. This department was also to include urban planning, which Lutyens described as the designing of landscape to harmonize with towns, villages, and single buildings. It is interesting that he evidently thought of urban planning as essentially a form of large-scale garden design. With the onset of war, and with the stroke he suffered in 1940, Lutyens did not have much opportunity to pursue this idea. However, by the time the memorial volumes were conceived, it was clear that the Royal Academy Architecture School was going to be refounded, and potential subscribers were informed that they were not only buying a set of books, but donating to the Lutyens Memorial Fund for Architectural Education. In the end, there were not any significant remaining funds to give to the Royal Academy, but it does show the intention of the committee to have a multivalent impact on the education of architects. Christopher Hussey was a natural choice to write Lutyens' biography because of his role at Country Life. As Clive Aslett has so beautifully demonstrated, Country Life was not only promoting Lutyens' work, but took him as their arbiter of taste. He dined weekly with the magazine's owner, Edward Hudson, at his house at Queen Anne's Gate, and he suggested which young architects the magazine might look into, and commented on the magazine's selections for upcoming issues. In order to produce the books, and as an act of charity, the Memorial Committee retained the staff of Lutyens' office at 13 Mansfield Street, hiring them as full-time employees of the committee. There were only 2 of them left. With the dwindling of active projects, Lutyens had reduced his staffing numbers by the late 30s. With the outbreak of war, all of the remaining staff had enlisted, except for 2. An assistant named George Stewart, who was too old to enlist, and a loyal secretary, Miss Webb. Miss Webb, who had managed the office for 22 years, was made secretary to the Memorial Committee, handling its correspondence, minutes, and much of the publicity. Stewart drew the architectural illustrations in ink to the exacting standards that had been expected when Lutyens was alive. The Lutyens office required careful precision in all details, but drawings were required not to be cluttered with technical detail so that the overall proportions and lines remained dominant. He created the illustrations to Butler's instructions, who asked him to focus on the major executed projects. Lutyens' widow, Lady Emily, and his son Robert continued living in the house at Mansfield Street, which for the time being was little changed, with his staff showing up for work every morning. In order to pursue his task, Hussey gathered stories and reminiscences from Lutyens' family, his colleagues, and his friends. Reading through the letters he gathered becomes like the funeral scene in Big Fish, where the friends meet to laugh and reminisce about the joy this person brought. There were short, sparkling letters from the Bloomsbury novelist Vita Sackville-West, letters from the elderly Sir Herbert Baker, the typed lines smudged and running off the page, from Oliver Hill, from Arthur Shoesmith, chief assistant on New Delhi, who seems mainly to have been concerned with correcting Hussey's spelling. There were letters from old employees, most of whom referred to him as Lut, from Hubert Worthington, Austin Hall, and Oswald Milne. They were all there, sharing favorite Lutyens jokes or telling what he meant to them. Many recalled his frequent saying that architecture wants seeing all round. Hussey must have thought it was too prosaic because he omitted it from the final biography. Worthington claimed that Lutyens told him when designing a building to always design the roof first. The specific joke that was mentioned most was Lutyens' response when an interviewer asked him what he thought should be done with the aging Crystal Palace. His answer was, "Put it under a glass case." An example of the sort of letters Hussey received is one from Clough Williams-Ellis, author and designer of the candy-colored Welsh town of Portmeirion. It is written in handwriting predictably full of flourishes and curlicues, the way I imagine Willy Wonka would write. He recalled his last meeting with Lutyens only a few months before his death. The last time I saw Sir Edwin was over the teacups in his library in Mansfield Street, whither I had gone to talk with him about Wren, with whose ghost I was due to broadcast an interview. Characteristically, he insisted on talking instead about Inigo Jones, who indeed he revered even more than Sir Christopher. Then he showed me the drawing on his board, where he was working away at the proposed Western Annex to Westminster Abbey, which was exhibited in last year's Academy, and over the site of which his coffin was lately borne into where we assembled to pay him our last tribute. On seeing his drawing, I had exclaimed, "Gothic? Oh, come, have the courage of your convictions. Don't be overawed by medievalism in your old age. Be yourself to the end. Out with your domes and urns and all your real Lutyens vocabulary." To which he had replied in his mock-frightened whisper, "Oh, but I should never dare." "Dare," said I. "Look at Wren with his twin towers that will be your background. He dared." "Yes," said Lutyens, "he did, and see the result. It's a mess. And anyway," he added, "I am trying to be good." But as he then explained, he looked for his reward in having a little quiet fun in the decor of the royal lavatories. It was all charming, but less than a quarter of the information contained in these letters ended up in the final book. It was not, in fact, enough information to make a full biography. Here is one of the original flyers advertising the memorial volumes to potential subscribers. Do you see anything different from the final publication? The committee had originally intended 4 volumes of architectural drawings and photographs, and that's it. They had only asked Hussey to write a short biographical introduction, which would be spread over the 4 volumes. A standalone biography became possible because Hussey was unexpectedly given access to 2 great caches of letters. The project was accordingly revised to 3 volumes of drawings and a separate Life of Lutyens. The first and most essential set of letters were those from Lutyens to his wife, Lady Emily, which she now made available. This allowed the story to be told partly in Lutyens' own voice, and because for most of their lives they wrote to each other nearly every day, it allowed the chronological, personal details of his life to be pieced together. The other cache of letters was important for understanding his architectural ideas. And that was his early letters to Sir Herbert Baker. Hussey drew on these heavily in explaining Lutyens' conversion to classicism around 1906. These letters include the one that famously begins, "Palladio's the game." Hussey was able to gain access to Baker's letters because at the time of Lutyens' death, he was already working with Baker on his autobiography, titled Architecture and Personalities. Baker, whose career had been damaged by his public quarrel with Lutyens over the gradient of Ricina Hill, always the gentleman, now sought to make his peace with Lutyens in the end. Elderly himself, and having recently suffered a stroke, he shuffled behind Lutyens' coffin during the funeral procession at Westminster Abbey. And at the urging of Hussey, he toned down his denunciation of Lutyens in Architecture and Personalities and extended his praise of his work. When Hussey completed the chapters on Lutyens' personal life, he sent them to Lady Emily for approval. "Provided my interpretation is reasonably truthful," he wrote, "and my selection of facts conveys the right idea in relation to the whole, I hope my inferences and manner of presentation, even if sometimes deviating from strict fact, may be allowed the same latitude as is given to a portrait painter." Lady Emily gave her approval. In fact, many family members wrote to say that they found it enlightening and moving. Before the books were printed, the committee pursued extensive targeted advertising. Flyers were posted or given to potential subscribers. They also paid for leaflets to be included in National Trust guidebooks and sent tidbits about Lutyens to the gossip columns of popular newspapers in a bid to keep him in the public consciousness. Who subscribed in the end? Of the subscribers listed in the back of Volume 3, a majority of named subscribers, at least 142, were architects. Among these, the most recognizable were architects who continued to practice in a traditional idiom after the war. E. Vincent Harris, Percy Thomas, Oliver Hill, T. Harold Hughes, Seeley and Paget, Philip Tilden, Edward Morph, and Bannister Fletcher, for instance. The only fully committed modernist on the list was Christopher Nicholson, whose father had been a close friend of Lutyens, and by the time the books were issued, had anyway died in a gliding accident. Many public libraries and architecture schools subscribed, as well as professional societies. Unsurprisingly, former clients were well represented, with Campion Hall ordering 2 sets, one for their library and one for Father Darcy. Even Selfridge's department store subscribed. Those from whom Hussey had solicited memories also received copies. They were delighted. "This is the man as I knew him," Shoesmith wrote in a congratulatory note. Reviewers hailed the life as a masterpiece. The committee was surprised. They had been planning a cheaper, abridged version of the architectural drawings, but instead switched their attention in 1953 to reprinting the biography as a standalone volume to be sold without the rest of the memorial. The reviews of the architecture volumes were also very positive, polite, as British reviews at that time generally were. But something is odd about their prose. They protested too much. For in truth, the reviewers, who included John Summerson, writing for both the New Statesman and the Reba Journal, didn't think there was much chance of the books making an impact on the immediate path of British architecture. Summerson's letter acknowledging Hussey's thanks for his review was cutting. Lutyens' architecture was too unfashionable for the books to make any impact, he said. It will not surprise me if the books remain more or less unread for 70 or even 100 years. Then there will be deserved and grateful tributes laid on the tombs of CH and ASGB. And he illustrated it with a Lutyens-like sketch. The historian David Watkin has written of this moment of pessimism in British culture as a time when many were fearful for the future of classicism, country houses, and English life more generally, in the face of a new welfare state, the cheap and cheerful modernism of the Festival of Britain, mechanization, soya beans, and basic English. The novel Brideshead Revisited was published at this same moment by another Lutyens admirer, Evelyn Waugh, which summed up some of the sense of loss and the fear that a golden age had ended. Lawrence Whistler, who reviewed the memorial volumes for the Times Literary Supplement, wrote, "I was devoted to Sir Ned, and often wish he were here, though here would not suit him very well now, so perhaps he was fortunate to go when he did." Harold Faulkner wrote, "Of course, no one gives two hoots for Lut now. Thanks to the leaders of architectural thought, the Skyline and Coventry Cathedral are the current vogue." Similarly, Clough Williams-Ellis declared, "His star will surely shine again, but there seems to be an obscuring cloud between him and the present." And there were many more in that vein. Arthur Butler perhaps put it most baldly in a private letter to Hussey about the architectural critic Nicholas Pevsner, who had a special dislike of Lutyens. "That Pevsner is an ass," he wrote. "To put Tigbourne Court, built in 1899, as the climax of Lutyens' work. His slightly patronizing attitude to the English got my goat. I hear he is a prof at Cambridge." Summerson well understood that for Hussey's generation, there had never been a time when Lutyens was not widely regarded as a genius. He had been the dominant figure in British architecture for their entire lives. The playwright E.V. Lucas had said that he thought Shakespeare must have been much like Lutyens. An early draft of Hussey's introduction had focused on the theme of genius. He wrote, "In our generation, it is indeed difficult to think of a more authentic instance of what is implied by that often misused term, the man of genius. There is no other adequate description of his peculiar combination of fantasy, seeming irresponsibility, schoolboyhood, with extreme fastidiousness, quickness of observation and thought, and direct responsibility for the most superb buildings of our time, a combination of which the general effect was a monumental adolescent, a Peter Pan sage, around whose hoary head played a nimbus of crackers." Even after the books were completed, there was still a mammoth task facing Arthur Butler. Surprisingly, it was only after the books were published that Butler and George Stewart began sorting through the 80,000 drawings left in Lutyens' office. Reba removed the drawings from Mansfield Street as they had promised and stored them in a room behind Euston Station that they had borrowed for the purpose from the University of London. Reba felt that they could not take on all of the drawings, which would require a large amount of storage space, and Butler was asked to sort through them and decide what was worth keeping. He went in 2 days a week to organize the dusty and heavy rolls. He had assumed that they would be mostly duplicates and details, but he found that there were lots of previously unknown letters, drawings of unbuilt projects, and most excitingly, rare original Lutyens sketches, 2,200 of them. He wrote to Hussey in jubilation, inviting him to come and see, but suggested that, quote, "If anybody asks why we didn't include the original sketches and unbuilt projects in the books, tell them we were focusing on the objective built architecture, which exists as architecture rather than merely on paper." "Oh well," Hussey replied, "someone will just have to do another book." Hussey hoped the occasion for such a book would be the Lutyens centennial in 1969. The original sketches, now vested in the Reba Drawings collection, provided a clear opportunity. He urged Reba to commission a new volume of essays and an exhibition for the occasion. Although they did commission essays on Lutyens from Hussey and the brutalist architects, the Smithsons, the Lutyens centennial failed. There was no book and no exhibition. The Reba secretary wrote that the younger members would not countenance spending their membership dues to celebrate an architect they didn't particularly like. However, in fact, two significant additional books of Lutyens' source materials eventually came out of the discussions that had started around the memorial volumes and the centennial. The volume of transcriptions of Lutyens' letters to Lady Emily, edited by Claire Percy and Jane Ridley, and the volume of drawings edited by Margaret Richardson in the Reba Drawings series. Although the centennial seemed to bode the worst for Lutyens' legacy, in fact, the tide was already beginning to turn. The memorial volumes were at the root of the change. By the late 1960s, Hussey was beginning to receive letters from young architects interested in Lutyens. Alan Greenberg sent a copy of his now famous article in Perspecta, which demonstrated the similarities between the work of Lutyens, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Le Corbusier. A doctoral student named Robert Grant Irving wrote asking for an interview, explaining that he was writing his thesis on Lutyens and Baker's work at New Delhi. Both men had been inspired by the memorial volumes. A decade earlier, Alan Greenberg had been taught from them as an architectural student in South Africa, and presumably Irving had discovered them at Yale. Although to Hussey the picture must have seemed grim, in reality the volumes had begun having an effect as soon as they were published. In the United States, Frank Lloyd Wright reviewed them favorably, and he used them to teach at Taliesin. They were distributed in the United States by Scribner. I haven't been able to find out how well they sold, but they must have been relatively popular. America was well known for its admiration of Lutyens. American architects visited him in such numbers during the 1920s that he had to begin turning them away because he said he otherwise couldn't get any work done. The AIA gave him its gold medal in 1925, and the British government decided to ask Lutyens to design their Washington embassy, stating that in order to show gratitude to the United States for its role in the First World War, they would give them a building by their favorite architect. And Lutyens had at least one American assistant in his office, whom the other draftsmen constantly taunted by singing Hands Across the Sea. Seemingly every major American architect of the interwar period, and many minor ones, had a copy of Lawrence Weaver's book about Lutyens. But how many of them bought the memorial volumes? Most of Lutyens' own generation, and the generation who had so admired him, were elderly, or at least quite established in their careers at that point. The Atlanta architect Philip Schuetze, for instance, to my surprise, does not seem to have purchased the memorial volumes. His copy of Weaver was enough. I would be curious to hear if any of you know of any American architects who did buy them in the early 50s. There are records of the memorial volumes occasionally being used for teaching in English-speaking architecture schools during the 1950s and 60s. Then, in 1966, Robert Venturi included Lutyens in Complexity and Contradiction. And it was in the book that defined postmodernism that many architects saw Lutyens' name for the first time. Soon, Venturi, Alan Greenberg, and the architectural historian Vincent Scully were encouraging MoMA to do an exhibition of Lutyens' work. The MoMA exhibition, an installation of photographs and plans curated by Greenberg, took place in 1978. The press releases pointed out that both Louis Kahn and Le Corbusier had expressed admiration for Lutyens' work. Corbusier had said that New Delhi demonstrated, quote, extreme care, great talent, and true success. A dinner the same year as the MoMA exhibition celebrated the 50th anniversary of the British Embassy in Washington, and Philip Johnson gave a speech about Lutyens' genius. If Philip Johnson was on board, one could be sure that opinion was beginning to turn in that direction. Encouraged by growing interest in the United States and also in Britain, a group of British scholars put together a showstopper exhibition at London's Hayward Gallery 3 years later. Displaying everything from spider-back chairs to Gertrude Jekyll's boots, the show was very well attended. Faith in international modernism had declined, and many architects and critics were completely wowed. So when a couple of years later, the young founders of a publishing house called the Antique Collectors Club asked the Reba librarian what the library's most requested out-of-print book was, they were told the Lutyens Memorial Volumes. In response to this information, Antique Collectors Club acquired the rights from a conglomerate publisher that had purchased the remnants of Country Life's book publishing wing. And they bought an original copy of the memorial volumes that could be disassembled for scanning. Funding support was secured from interested American architects who subscribed to the reprint, much as the original subscribers had done in the late 1940s. Thus, in 1984, the memorial volumes were available for purchase once again. It was not an exact recreation. They were smaller, the drawings were slightly fuzzier as a result of the scanning process, and they were printed on slick paper. But Lutyens' star was no longer obscured by cloud. The books addressed a clear demand and quickly became rare again. The Life remained comparatively easy to find, but the architecture volumes were now what people wanted. Prices went back up, and people would sometimes bid sets up to thousands of dollars at auction. In 2003, in response to this commercial demand, the Antique Collectors Club reprinted Volume 1, the volume of house designs most coveted by architects. But the complete sets have remained hard to find. That is, until now. The reprint, now undertaken with clear drawings and beautiful graphic design, is the great work of the ICAA Books Committee. Matt Inquist, Ann Mann, Brian Connolly, and Michael Mesko, who partnered with ACC Art Books to bring these extraordinary volumes into the hands of today's students and architects, just as its originators dreamed. This is no mere scan and reprint. Rather, Matt Inquist and Brian Connolly volunteered their time to source every image from the original Country Life photographic files. Every drawing was carefully enhanced so that there is none of the fuzziness found in the previous reprints. With their focus on illustration and careful devotion to image quality, these are books that Lutyens would have approved of. It's no use talking architecture, he often said. You must draw it. When addressing a group of architecture students in 1920, he gave some insight into his system of design, responding to a question about Gothic architecture by saying, "I do not like the pointed arch. It is too easy to get out of difficulties with it. One cannot alter the round arch, but there is no difficulty with the pointed, and therefore there is not the same discipline." The same day, when asked, "What is proportion?" he answered, "God." I think I will allow Lutyens' friend, the acoustic engineer Hope Bagnall, to have the last word. Bagnall said that he felt that Lutyens had developed a limited system of motifs and proportions because this created discipline. They became a familiar musical scale, and through them, he communicated. The memorial volumes allow us to learn Lutyens' musical scale, not so that we can copy it, but so that we can see how such a system can be created to give order to architectural work. And that is a valuable contribution indeed. Thank you very much.